Now let's get into kind of an overview of the painting workflow here in Corel Painter, so you can see how everything works together. So really the best thing you can do is just start experimenting with brushes. Go over here and try out all the different brush categories, and then try out the variants within those categories. There are a lot of brushes in Corel Painter, so I don't expect that you're going to use all of these brushes, but you do want to try to get a feel for what Corel Painter can do. That way you have an idea of which brushes to select for particular types of tasks. Here in the brush selector, you can actually see a stroke preview to give you an idea of what that brush looks like and what it can do. And you can also see the dab or the tip of the brush. So if you were just to dab this brush down, this is what you would get. If you were to make a stroke, then it might look something like this. You can also expand this panel and make it larger so you can show more brushes at once just by dragging it down. And you can drag it out like this to make it wider. And you can show your brushes kind of long like this. So this can be really whichever kind of shape you like. You can go back to your canvas and start painting. And when you go back to your brush selector, it will retain that shape. The orange that's in the stroke preview shows you the fall off of the paint. So if you were to paint with this, it would start out with a little bit of paint and then it would kind of fade out. So if I select clumpy brush, then you can see if I do a long stroke, the paint fades out to white. So that lets you kind of blend your paint as you're putting down paint, because white essentially is the canvas color, so blending to white gives you that kind of pseudo blending effect. There are other brushes that can blend to transparency, but we'll come back to those in a bit. If we go to the particle brushes category, then we don't have a dab because the dab's going to look different every time you use this brush. So the dab is either going to show you the shape of the brush, or it's going to show you what type of brush it is and what it can do. For example, if I choose Flow Fur and I paint with it, then I'm going to get something that looks kind of like fur. I'm going to use my keyboard shortcuts to clear that out. Now I'm not going to go in depth into how to hold a pen and how to use a drawing tablet because I have reference videos you can watch about that. But I will go through some of the basics of how to use your brush here in Corel Painter. So let's go ahead and switch back to acrylics and oils. Let's go to opaque detail brush. Now if we look at our brush cursor, we have this little circle. That circle often represents the maximum size of that brush if you press down using full pen pressure. But I could also use very light pen pressure to make that mark thinner. Now that circle disappears once you start painting and all you see is the crosshair, but it does give you a good indication of what size your brush is going to be. You also have a line that comes off of it, and that represents the tilt of your pen. If your brush supports pen tilt, and if your tablet supports pen tilt, if you're using an airbrush can spray in a certain direction, so if you tilt your pen, you can spray in one direction or another. So if we go to the airbrushes category here, and we choose coarse spray jitter, then you can see the tilt of my pen can change the direction that the airbrush sprays out. Let's go ahead and switch our brush back to acrylics and oils. Let's go back to opaque detail brush. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our cursor represents the maximum size of our brush when we paint. If we want to change the size of our brush, we can go up here to the properties bar. We can enter a numeric value, or we can click here and drag this slider. If you hold Control, you can drag the slider slowly in smaller increments. If you let go of Control, then you can drag it in larger increments. So I could make my brush larger this way, and now my maximum size of my brush is much larger, as is my brush cursor. But that's not necessarily the best way to resize your brush unless you're going for a very specific point size. A better way to resize your brush is to hold down Control and Alt on your keyboard, and then drag with your pen or your mouse, and then you can resize your brush visually on screen. This is my preferred way to resize my brush. If you want to make your brush incrementally bigger or smaller, you can also use the right and left bracket keys on your keyboard. Pressing the right bracket repeatedly will make your brush a little bit bigger, and then pressing the left bracket key will make it just a little bit smaller each time you press the key. As I mentioned earlier, if you're using a drawing tablet, then you can use lighter pressure to make thinner lines, or heavier pressure to make thicker lines, and you can get everything in between. But you can also control the opacity or the transparency of a brush using pen pressure as well. So let's find a brush that can do that. Let's go to airbrushes, and let's choose digital soft pressure airbrush. Now if I use very light pressure, then I get a thinner airbrushing, but if I start to use heavier pressure, it starts to get thicker. Let's try that again. Let's use very, very, very light pressure, and you get hardly anything, whereas if you use very heavy pressure, then it's much thicker and more opaque. So if you used a really big brush here, you could use this to kind of fade your sky down, like so, and you could create a really nice gradient this way. Now if you're having trouble getting that opacity to work properly with your pen pressure, again, you can go to Edit, Preferences, and then go to Brush Tracking, And here you may want to calibrate your brush if it's not responding exactly the way you want. Now it's responding a lot better, and I'm able to get that range of opacity much more easily. We can also change the opacity just like we can change the brush size up here in the properties bar, and then it'll reach its maximum opacity, which will be 9. If we increase that up to 100%, then the maximum opacity we can get is much darker. And then I can get more of a range in between by having a higher opacity setting. There are brushes that can respond to both brush width and brush opacity. So we could go to Fine Detail Air in the Airbrushes category. If we press lightly, we get a thin mark that's very transparent. And if we press down hard, then we get a thicker, wider mark that's more opaque. And we can get everything in between. Now, another thing I want to mention is that some brushes are in specific categories. So this is an airbrush. It's called Fine Detail Air. And if it's big enough, then sure, it looks kind of like an airbrush. But if you made this brush really small, it kind of looks like a pen or a pencil. So what's important is not to think about the category you're choosing when you're selecting a brush that you want to use. Just look at the brush, and if it's a good fit, then use it. It doesn't matter what category it's in. So although this is considered to be an airbrush, I might want to use this as a pen or a pencil. Now let's take a look at the basics of choosing color. I've been choosing color a little bit here using the color selector, and it should be pretty straightforward. You can click on the hue ring here to select the hue or the pure color. So that's red or orange or yellow. And if you want different shades of red within this triangle, you can change the value or the lightness and darkness on the vertical axis, or you can change the saturation or the intensity of the color on the horizontal axis. And you can really quickly go in here and find the exact color that you want. So if you wanted a dark red, it's down here. If you wanted a bright red, it's up here. If you wanted kind of a muted pastel red, it's right here. If you want this to be larger, you can drag it from the edge and you can make it absolutely humongous here on the screen, or you can shrink it down if you like. The little circle within the triangle shows you the color you have selected, but you can also see that here in this little color swatch. And what can be helpful is to be able to put down some paint, move your color picker over, then you have your original color on top of the color you put down, and you can make some very subtle changes to that color. And you can see that color swatch is split, showing you your current color and your previous color. So I could make a minor change like that and paint, and it's very easy to compare two colors. So your color is going to remain static until you change it. So for example, if I change my brush to a different type of brush, such as an acrylic brush, when I paint, I'm going to get that color. If I change to a different brush, let's say the sponge is glazing sponge, then I'm going to get that same color. Now you may find that depending on the type of media that you're using, it may get darker and build up like this, or it might get lighter, or it might change in some different ways, and so your color might be a little bit more dynamic and not the same color that you selected. So in this case, it's almost like I'm using a different type of paint. I'm not using opaque, thick paint like an oil or an acrylic. I may be stamping some ink or something, or some watercolor on top of this acrylic using a sponge. This is a glazing sponge, and so as the name implies, I'm putting a thin glaze of paint that's transparent over the paint that's underneath. So earlier we looked at undo and redo. We know that we can undo and redo using the shortcut up here, but there's also a keyboard command for that, and that is Control-Z to undo and Control-Y to redo. We also know that we can select all and then hit backspace to clear everything, but we can also just erase if we want to. You could select the eraser tool in the toolbar, and you can erase, or you can flip your pen over if it has an eraser, and you can use the eraser on the pen. So if I go back to my brush tool here, and let's go back to acrylics and oils and opaque detail brush, then I can draw with the tip of my pen. I can flip my pen over and I can erase with the eraser end. And I can quickly switch back and forth between painting and erasing that way. But there's also a keyboard shortcut. You can hit N for the eraser, and anytime you can get to the eraser tool that way. And then you can hit B, which is right next to N on your keyboard, to switch back to your brush. So B and N are a quick way to go back and forth between painting and erasing. You can use express keys on your Wacom tablet to accomplish this as well, or your pen may have buttons on it. You can set those buttons to do different things like resize your brush or erase. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. You may also find that there's some specialty erasers in some of these categories. I'm going to go to digital watercolor, choose broad water brush. I'm going to put down some paint here, and then I'm going to go back to this menu and I'm going to choose gentle wet eraser. And then now I can erase in kind of a watercolor style. Now if I compare that to just using my regular eraser, it looks a bit more natural for that particular brush category. You do have some control over the hardness of your eraser. You can make it harder or softer if you like. You can also change the size of your eraser up here as well as the opacity. So I can make the eraser more opaque, give it a softer edge, make it bigger, and I can get kind of a more subtle erasing over everything rather than something that's too strong. I'm going to switch to a different type of brush. Now we may as well look at recent brushes, because recent brushes is a much faster way to switch back and forth between brushes that you've recently used. You can find that here in the brush selector. While I'm here, I'm just going to make that not so big. Or if you go to the window menu, then you can toggle on recent brushes, and those can always be up here in the top. That way you can quickly go back to the opaque detail brush without having to hunt for it in the menu. So as we looked at, I can paint with the tip of my pen, and I can erase with the eraser end, but I can also blend with the eraser. To do that, we'll use the eraser end to select the brush that we want. So I'm going to click up here, click on blenders. Let's try coarse smear blender jitter, and then I can go ahead and just blend. Now if I flip my pen back over to the tip, now when I draw, it goes back to opaque detail brush, and when I flip it over, it goes back to the blender. So I can go back and forth between blending and erasing very easily. But basically what this means is that I can select one brush for this end of my pen and one brush for this end. And if you're using a Wacom pen, your eraser has pressure sensitivity as well. Even though the tip's a bit bigger, you can still get some pretty interesting results using it. If you ever wanted the eraser end to go back to erasing, then use the eraser end to select the eraser tool, and then it'll go back to its normal function. You can flip it over and erase. So now I'm going to go ahead and just put down some different colors here. I'll put down some red and some blue and some yellow. Now when we're picking colors, we can do that here in the color picker, but what if we've already put down some colors on the canvas? Well, we can select those colors off the canvas by selecting the dropper tool. We can click on a color and you can see it automatically selects it in the color picker. And I can go in between all these different colors. I can even get blends in between the colors like this. This is going to be sampling a very small area, so the pixel you click on is the color you're going to get. If I go back to my brush tool with the B key on my keyboard and paint, then you can see I get that intermediate color there. While I'm painting with the brush tool, I can also hold down Alt, and at any time I can invoke the dropper tool so I can quickly sample these colors and put them down as I'm painting. There are also other ways to pick color. For example, I can go to my color sets here, and I have different swatches or different paint tubes or different wells of paint like you'd get with a kit of paints. So if I wanted this specific manganese blue, I could get that. Or if I wanted emerald, I could get that. And so if this is a better way to pick color for you, you can do it this way as well. You can drag the bottom of this window to show more colors at once if you like. You can also choose colors on a mixer pad. So if you wanted to, for example, put down some paint, you can click on Apply Color. You could put down this green, select a darker green, put down some of that next to it, and I could make color strings like this. Then when you're ready to sample that color, you can click on Sample Color, and you can sample the color that you want. Click back over here, and it's just like picking colors off of a real palette. You can restore this to its default, or you can erase it and make it blank if you like. There's also some color swatches up here as well. Down here at the bottom, you can change the brush size, which relates to apply color. So if I select a color here and put it down, the size of the stroke I get is determined by this slider here, so I can get a bigger or smaller mark. I'm going to switch my brush to something different. Let's try Clumpy Brush. I'll just paint something that looks kind of like a flower. And let's say that this is our masterpiece and we're ready to save our artwork. There's a shortcut for saving up here in the Properties bar, or you can go to File and you can choose Save, or you can choose Save As. Now if you haven't yet saved your document, then it doesn't really matter what you choose. Let's choose Save. Then we can choose where to save our artwork, as well as give it a name. We'll call this Flower, and you want to save it in a folder where you'll be able to find it later. It may be helpful to sort those folders by year, and then maybe by month or by project within that folder. That way you'll always know where to look for something. I have a reference video you can watch about file management if you're interested in learning more about that subject. You can also choose the format to save your file as. Painter Riff is the default format, and that means that if you choose Painter Riff, it's going to be the most compatible with Corel Painter, but it won't be compatible with any other software. If you want to be able to take this painting into Photoshop or another app that supports the PSD format, then you'll of course want to choose that, but that might have an effect on your document and the way it looks. We'll come back to that in a bit. You can also choose TIFF, PNG, JPEG, GIF, and bitmap. We're not going to get into detail about those right now, so for now we'll just go ahead and choose Painter Riff. We won't worry about uncompressed, but if you did want your file to be uncompressed, you could choose that. You can choose to embed your color profile here or not embed it. So for now, we'll go ahead and just save this. And now we've successfully saved our artwork. Now you want to be saving your master copies or your originals as a Painter RIF file, but if you were going to then make this smaller and share it for the web, or maybe send it somewhere to be printed, then you may want to go to File, Save As, and then you can save a copy. So if you wanted to make it smaller first, you could do that. Then you could change the format to PNG or JPEG or PSD or whatever your printer requires. If you're going to post it on the web, you could choose PNG or JPEG. So for example, I'll choose PNG, and I'll call it -web. That way I know this is the web version, and then I can have 2 copies of this file, my master copy or my original, and then a smaller version for the web. You can also use File Save As to save iterations of your file. That way if you make a major change and you want to be able to go back to an older version of your artwork, you can do that. I highly recommend this because it can save you a lot of frustration. So if I wanted to do that, I could call this Flower 2, Flower 3, Flower 4, and so on. So now that we know how to experiment with brushes to create some test artwork and then save it, we can move on to some other subjects.